Eleanor Whittaker was 68 years old when she learned how cleanly a life could be erased. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, the long walnut table shining beneath the afternoon light as if it had been prepared for something dignified, something orderly, something almost sacred. But there was nothing sacred in the way her stepson kept checking his watch, or in the way her stepdaughter sat with one perfectly crossed leg and a look of patient inconvenience on her face, as though the end of a 40-year marriage were simply another appointment she had to get through before dinner. Eleanor kept her hands folded in her lap because she had always believed that love, if it meant anything, meant staying. Staying when the money was thin. Staying when grief turned a house hollow. Staying when other people grew careless with your heart. And now, after 40 years of staying, she was being spoken around. The house will need to be vacated within 10 business days, the attorney said gently, though there was no gentleness in the words. Something cold moved under Eleanor's ribs. Then, just as the papers were being stacked and her stepchildren were already discussing paint colors for rooms she had slept in for decades, the attorney reached into his briefcase and slid a second envelope toward her. It was cream-colored, sealed with dark blue wax, and heavier than paper should have been. Inside, she could hear the faint metallic shift of something small. A separate instruction, he said. From your husband. To be opened alone. Eleanor touched the envelope as if it might burn her. On the back, in Richard's unmistakable hand, were 8 words. For when they believe there is nothing left. If this story reaches something tender in you, stay with it until the very end, because the key inside that envelope did not open what anyone in that room believed it would. Subscribe here. Some stories do not reveal their mercy until the last locked door gives way. 40 years earlier, Eleanor had not imagined that her life would be built out of endurance. She had been 28 when she met Richard Whittaker at a church supper in Fairfield, Connecticut, the kind of autumn evening where the air carried wood smoke from neighboring chimneys and the folding tables in the parish hall were lined with casseroles, pound cake, and women who noticed everything. Eleanor had come because her friend Judith had insisted, and because saying no had always been harder for her than rearranging herself to fit what others needed. Richard had come because his mother feared he was becoming too silent after the death of his first wife. He was 34 then, broad-shouldered, serious, already carrying the grave steadiness of a man who had seen too much too young. He had 2 children, Vanessa, who was 7 and already observant in a way that could feel like judgment, and Grant, who was 4 and still clung to trouser legs when tired. Richard did not flirt with Eleanor that night. He asked if she wanted more coffee. He noticed when she shivered and moved the space heater closer without comment. He listened when she spoke, which in those days felt almost miraculous. Eleanor had grown up believing that attention was one of the purest forms of love. Her father repaired radios in a narrow shop on Main Street. Her mother hemmed dresses for women wealthier than they were, women who swept in smelling of perfume and impatience. Their house was small, their winters drafty, but the kitchen was always warm, and Eleanor learned young that care lived in the ordinary things. Soup stirred slowly, collars pressed carefully, bills paid on time even when it meant new shoes had to wait. She had dreamed once of studying design, perhaps landscapes or interior spaces, because she could look at any room and imagine where light ought to fall. But her mother's illness came first, and then the work of keeping the household standing, and then, as often happens in certain lives, the years that were meant to be temporary simply became the shape of adulthood. Richard proposed on a cold March evening with no orchestra of romance around it, no kneeling spectacle, no rehearsed speech. He stood in her parents' kitchen while rain tapped softly against the window and said, "I cannot promise easy. But I can promise I will never be careless with you." She believed him. For many years, he kept that promise as well as he knew how. She stepped into widow dark rooms and brought them back to life. She learned Vanessa's particular silences, the way the girl's grief came out sideways in slammed drawers and unfinished meals. She learned that Grant slept better if someone left the hall light on. She packed lunches, attended school concerts, listened to feverish midnight crying through thin doors, sat beside them at parent meetings where she was sometimes introduced as Richard's wife, and sometimes, more pointedly, as not their real mother, as if tenderness required blood to count. She never corrected anyone. She just kept showing up. When Richard's architectural firm nearly folded in the recession of the early 90s, Eleanor took evening work at Bellamy's bookshop, dusting shelves and balancing the till after dinner. When Grant broke his arm at 12 and Vanessa needed tuition money for a summer program she was desperate to attend, Eleanor sold the pearl bracelet her own mother had left her and told no one. When Richard's mother, Estelle, had her stroke, it was Eleanor who moved the guest room downstairs, learned the rhythm of medications, softened vegetables, changed sheets in the middle of the night, and rubbed lotion into thinning skin while Estelle stared at the ceiling and called her by the names of people long dead. Years layered themselves the way years do. School became college. College became marriages, careers, distances. The children grew polished in adulthood, but not particularly warm. Vanessa went into real estate, learned to smile with only half her face, and married a corporate attorney who treated every conversation like a negotiation. Grant moved through business ventures with a confidence that was often mistaken for competence. Richard grew successful. Very successful. His firm designed waterfront developments, high-end renovations, boutique hotels with reclaimed beams and curated authenticity. Their house became larger, then more beautiful, then full of objects expensive enough that people noticed them before they noticed the woman who dusted them. Eleanor remained who she had always been. She sent birthday cards on time. She remembered allergies, anniversaries, the exact way Richard liked his tea when he worked late. She kept the lilies blooming by the front walk. She stood in the kitchen with flour on her cheek while caterers carried trays through her home for charity dinners planned largely for appearances. She became, without ever quite consenting to it, the emotional infrastructure beneath everyone else's lives. And because she did this well, they began to mistake her steadiness for inexhaustibility. Cruelty rarely arrives all at once. More often, it comes disguised as habit. Vanessa developed a way of patting Eleanor's arm in front of guests when explaining family history, saying things like, "Of course, Father had already built the Real Foundation before Eleanor came along," with a smile so smooth it took a second for the insult to bloom. Grant stopped asking before borrowing money and started informing. Richard, busy and tired and increasingly prone to long silences, would sometimes let these things pass. Not because he did not hear them. Because he hated scenes. Because illness had begun, quietly, to stalk him through the years before any diagnosis became official. Because even good men can commit terrible failures by choosing comfort over correction. Eleanor told herself not to mind. She told herself families were complicated. She told herself devotion was not a ledger. But she noticed things. She noticed that Richard had begun taking long drives alone on Thursdays and returning with salt on his coat in months when he had no coastal projects scheduled. She noticed receipts from a hardware supplier in a county they never visited. She noticed a rolled set of drawings once left partly open on his study desk, a glimpse of cedar siding, deep porches, north arrows, and the initials Emmich Residence written in the lower corner. When she asked him what it was, he had placed his hand over the page and said, with a softness that was almost sorrowful, "Something I should have given more thought to years ago." Another time, when the first snow of the season had powdered the back garden silver, Richard stood by the kitchen window and asked, "If you could begin again anywhere, what would the house sound like?" She laughed, assuming he was indulging one of his architect moods. "Sound like this. The first thing you hear before you see it." Eleanor wiped her hands on a dish towel and considered. Water, maybe. Or wind through trees. Floorboards that know how to keep secrets. A kettle. Pages turning. Richard looked at her so intently then that she had to glance away. "You should have had a house that belonged to you," he said. She smiled, thinking it a lovely, impossible sentence. "I have one." But something in his face did not ease. If you have ever lived beside someone for decades, you know the map of their smallest changes. The slight delay before an answer. The way regret settles in the shoulders. The new habit of waking at 3 in the morning and standing in the dark kitchen without turning on a light. By the time Richard's heart began to fail in ways the doctors could no longer soften with vague phrases, Eleanor had already been grieving him for months without naming it. He became thinner, quieter. He tired halfway up the stairs. He kept one old brass key in the pocket of his robe and turned it over in his fingers when thinking. Sometimes Eleanor would wake and find him watching her with a strange expression, as if he were trying to memorize not her face but the fact of her still being there. Then, one evening in late November, while rain traveled in silver lines down the windows and a pot of soup went cooling untouched on the stove, Richard reached for her hand and said, "If anything becomes ugly after I'm gone, wait before you decide what I meant." Eleanor frowned. Nothing is becoming ugly. But the word stayed. Richard died 12 days later, just before dawn, with a winter sky paling at the edges and the room still holding the antiseptic chill of oxygen tubing and hospital linens. Eleanor had one hand on his chest when the last breath left him. She thought, in that blinding first instant, not of property or papers or any of the low practical matters that arrive so quickly after death. She thought only this: I am now alone in the world in a way I have never been before. The funeral was full. Richard had been admired. Men spoke about his vision, his discipline, his legacy in brick and glass. Vanessa cried elegantly. Grant hugged people with an expression of burdened manhood. He seemed almost to be rehearsing. Eleanor stood in black wool and received casseroles, condolences, and perfumed embraces from women who said, "I don't know what you'll do now," as though widowhood were a country she had been deported to without a passport. She began to notice, in the week after the funeral, how quickly the house changed temperature. Vanessa was suddenly always there, moving through rooms with a yellow legal pad in her hand. Grant took phone calls in Richard's study with the door closed. Patricia, Richard's younger sister, who had always been courteous in the way some people are courteous to hotel staff, began using phrases like "the family silver" and "father's side" with increasing frequency, as though Eleanor were a temporary guest in a story she had lived inside for 4 decades. One afternoon Eleanor found Vanessa in the dining room opening drawers. "I'm just being proactive," Vanessa said lightly. "There will be so much to sort, and I know paperwork overwhelms you." Paperwork overwhelms you. Eleanor had balanced tax files, medical claims, payroll emergencies, tuition checks, and mortgage anxieties for 40 years. But she said nothing. She simply closed the drawer Vanessa had opened and went to make tea with hands that had started to tremble. The will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Rain had started before dawn and continued all day, a cold winter rain that turned the city reflective and gray. Eleanor wore the navy coat Richard had bought her on their 25th anniversary and sat in the back of the car while the driver took her downtown, watching blurred storefronts slide past like memories already withdrawing. She carried a handkerchief in her sleeve, though she had not cried since the funeral. Grief had moved deeper than tears by then. It had become weight, pressure, a dull internal weather. The attorney's office occupied the top floor of an old limestone building with brass elevators and thick carpets that muffled footsteps. Martin Kessler, who had handled Richard's business matters for years, greeted her with a face carefully arranged into sympathy. Vanessa and Grant were already seated. Patricia stood by the window, speaking in a low voice into her phone, then ending the call with an expression of efficient annoyance when Eleanor entered. There are moments when a human body understands danger before the mind gives it language. Eleanor felt it when no one rose. Martin began with formalities. Richard Whittaker, being of sound mind. Certain distributions. The residence on Hawthorne Lane to be held jointly by Vanessa and Grant. The controlling interest in Whittaker Design Group to Grant, with advisory rights to Vanessa. The lake property to Vanessa. Estelle's heirloom jewelry to Patricia. Various charitable pledges. Certain art, furnishings, and collections to be distributed according to an itemized memorandum. Eleanor waited for the sentence that would restore proportion to the room. It did not come. Instead, Martin cleared his throat and said, "For my wife, Eleanor Hart Whittaker, I direct that a transitional allowance in the amount of $5,000 per month be paid for 3 months from the date of my death. She may remove her personal effects within 10 business days." The silence afterward was so complete Eleanor could hear the tiny mechanical click of the wall clock. Surely, she thought. Surely there is more. There was not. Not in the will as read aloud. The room did not tilt dramatically the way people say it does in stories. It narrowed. Her hearing sharpened in useless, humiliating ways. She heard the rustle of Vanessa uncrossing her legs. The soft slide of Patricia putting her phone back in her handbag. The tiny wet sound of rain against the glass. Eleanor looked at Martin Kessler and saw, in the set of his mouth, that he knew how monstrous this sounded and intended to do nothing about it. Richard discussed private provisions with me, he added carefully. There may be additional items outside probate, though I am not at liberty to speculate. Grant exhaled, almost a laugh. Vanessa reached over and squeezed Eleanor's wrist. "Oh, Eleanor," she said with polished tenderness, "please don't make this harder than it already is. Father wanted clarity. That's all. Father wanted clarity." The phrase entered her like a blade. Her hand had gone so cold she could barely feel the skin of her own fingers. 40 years. 40 years of mornings, of medications, of packed lunches, of postponed wants, of dinners kept warm, of hospital chairs and tax envelopes and grief absorbed for other people so they might move through life unbroken. Reduced to a transitional allowance and 10 business days. That was when Martin passed her the sealed envelope. No one else seemed interested in it. They had already begun, with breathtaking speed, to inhabit the future in which Eleanor had been moved aside. Grant asked a question about transfer taxes. Patricia mentioned the silver inventory. Vanessa was saying she would bring in her decorator before the spring market changed. Eleanor stared at the cream paper in her hand. For when they believe there is nothing left. She placed it in her handbag and stood with all the dignity she had left to gather around herself. "I think," she said quietly, "I should go home." The word home nearly undid her. Vanessa rose then, all concern. "Of course. Take your time. And please, Eleanor, only pack what is truly yours. It will spare everyone confusion later." There was fake kindness, sharpened to cruelty by precision. Only pack what is truly yours. Eleanor inclined her head once, because if she opened her mouth, she feared something ungoverned might come out, and she had never given them the satisfaction of seeing her unravel. She made it to the elevator before the first wave of rage arrived. It came not as heat but as a hard, metallic pressure at the back of her throat. By the time she stepped into the lobby, her body was shaking. Outside, the rain struck the pavement in silver needles. The driver opened the car door. Eleanor stood under the awning and could not move. People hurried past carrying umbrellas, coffee cups, packages, lives still coherently their own. She wanted, with a sudden and terrible force, to turn back upstairs and lay 40 years down on that polished table like evidence. Did you forget who kept him alive after the bypass? Did you forget whose hands bathed your grandmother? Did you forget the tuition, the holidays, the funeral clothes, the way I never once let you feel unwelcome in a house that did not have to open itself to you at all? But rage is a poor instrument in the hands of the dignified. It burns inward. She got into the car. The house on Hawthorne Lane was still hers for 10 days, apparently, but it no longer received her like a home. Vanessa's car was already in the drive. So was Grant's. The foyer table held stacks of file folders. Someone had opened the linen closet upstairs. In the kitchen, 2 mugs sat in the sink as if the new regime had already forgotten the courtesy of hiding its footprints. Eleanor went to her bedroom and closed the door, though even that felt temporary now. Her room. Not our room. The room she had shared with Richard for decades suddenly seemed arranged around an absence so large it had swallowed the air. His reading glasses still lay on the nightstand. The sweater he had worn at the hospital was draped over the chair. On the dresser stood the wedding photograph taken under a veil of June rain, Eleanor young and serious, Richard looking at her as if astonished by his own good fortune. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally opened the envelope. Inside was the brass key she had heard shifting. It was old, heavy, beautifully made, with the number 11 stamped into the bow and a small tag of weathered leather tied through the ring. On the leather, in faded ink, was written one word: Blackbird. Beneath the key lay a folded note in Richard's hand. If this reaches you, then events have unfolded as I feared they might. I am sorry for the cruelty of what you have just endured. More sorry than these words can hold. Take the enclosed directions. Go to Blackbird House in Maine. Go alone, and go before anyone persuades you not to. Jonah Mercer has been told to expect you. He will place the rest in your hands. Please trust me one last time. Bridget. Under the note were printed directions, old-fashioned and precise. Interstate numbers, county roads, a final turn onto Mercer Line Road, then 3 miles through protected woodland to a gate without a name. Eleanor stared at the page until the letters blurred. She felt fear then, colder and deeper than rage. Fear of being made foolish again. Fear of trusting a dead man who had, only an hour earlier, appeared to have discarded her with astonishing cleanliness. Fear of leaving the only life she had known. Fear, too, of staying and being slowly dismantled by people who had been waiting far longer than she understood. That night they opened wine downstairs. She could hear them from the bedroom where she sat in the dark without turning on a lamp, the soft pop of a cork, the rise and fall of voices, once a burst of laughter too careless to be accidental. The sound moved through the floorboards and into her body like insult made audible. At one point Vanessa knocked and opened the door before being invited in. "We thought you might want some soup," she said, carrying a tray Eleanor had not requested. "You really should eat. Shock can do strange things at your age." "At your age?" Eleanor looked at the tray, at the bowl she had probably used 100 times to feed that same woman when she was sick as a child, and said, "Leave it there, please." Vanessa set it down and lingered. "For what it's worth, I did tell Father he could have handled things more generously. But he was practical. He knew how dependent you were on him." "Dependent?" Eleanor lifted her eyes then, and something in them must have unsettled Vanessa, because for one brief second the younger woman's expression flickered. "Good night, Vanessa," Eleanor said. Vanessa left. The soup went cold. The next days were a descent through layers of indignity so fine and relentless they became almost abstract in their cruelty. Vanessa brought in a woman named Celia to assess the interiors, and Celia walked through Eleanor's home speaking of staging potential, while Eleanor's clothes still hung in closets. Grant arrived with a contractor who measured Richard's study for built-ins and referred to the space as "my office," without so much as lowering his voice. Patricia began placing small adhesive tags beneath certain antiques and frames, earmarking what she called family pieces, though Eleanor remembered choosing many of them herself, paying for some, polishing all. On the third day Eleanor found one of the housekeepers emptying the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. "I'm sorry," the woman whispered, stricken. Miss Vanessa said to separate personal from estate. Personal from estate. As if a life could be sorted by strangers into bins. Eleanor did not shout. She thanked the woman and finished the task herself, kneeling on the rug with old linens spread around her like surrendered flags. In the bottom of the chest she found letters from her mother, recipe cards in Estelle's wavering hand, a dried corsage from Vanessa's graduation, a small blue sweater Grant had worn home from the hospital after pneumonia when he was 9. She sat back on her heels and held that sweater so tightly the wool imprinted her palms. By the 6th day, despair had settled in. It was not dramatic. It was heavier than that. A numb, flattened thing. She rented a room at a roadside inn because she could no longer bear the sound of people making plans inside her own walls. The room smelled of bleach and old heat. The bedspread was patterned with roses the color of faded flesh. Outside the window, the parking lot hummed under a sodium light. Eleanor ate crackers for dinner and sat in one chair with the brass key in her lap, listening to the unfamiliar plumbing groan behind the wall. Her whole life, she had believed that if she gave enough, noticed enough, endured enough, love would eventually become safe. At 68, in a room no one would ever choose twice, she faced the possibility that she had built her faith around the wrong altar. It is possible to feel rage and grief and terror all at once, but despair is different. Despair is when the body stops arguing. When even weeping feels extravagant. When you begin to imagine your own disappearance not as tragedy, but as administrative convenience. Eleanor did not want to die. She was far too disciplined for melodrama. But she did understand, in that motel room, how a person might begin to loosen their grip on the future. Then the key shifted in her hand. A tiny sound. Metal against metal. And for reasons she could not fully explain, she heard Richard's voice as clearly as if he were seated across from her. "Wait before you decide what I meant." The next morning she rose before dawn, packed her suitcase, checked out of the inn, and began driving north. The world looked raw and newly washed after night rain. By the time she crossed into Massachusetts, low fog lay over the fields like wool pulled thin. Service stations appeared and vanished. Town names slid by on green signs. Eleanor drove with both hands on the wheel and the directions on the passenger seat, taking exits she had never taken, eating an apple at a rest stop because hunger had become practical again. Somewhere in New Hampshire the sky opened into a blue so wide it startled her. Pine forests deepened. Rivers flashed silver through the trees. She rolled down the window once and smelled cold earth, gasoline, and distant wood smoke, and felt, for the first time in days, something that was not pain. Not hope. Not yet. But movement. By afternoon the road narrowed. Coastal wind found the seams of the car. She stopped at a diner outside Portsmouth and drank coffee from a thick white mug while two women in raincoats discussed school budgets in the booth behind her. No one knew her there. No one watched her face for collapse. The waitress called her honey without intimacy and refilled her cup before it was empty. Eleanor nearly wept from the smallness of the kindness. She reached Maine as evening lowered itself into amber. There was a point, following Richard's directions, when the main road gave way to a county route lined with stone walls and half-bare maples. Then came a smaller road, then a gravel turn so unmarked she passed it once and had to reverse carefully between ditches. Mercer Line Road was little more than a ribbon through dense woodland. The trees rose on both sides, dark and fragrant, and the tires crackled over old leaves and scattered pine cones. Sunlight slipped through in broken gold bars. Her heart began to pound. At the end of 3 miles, exactly as the directions had promised, stood a black iron gate set into a long stone wall. No name. Only a keyhole. Eleanor got out. The air smelled of cedar, salt, and approaching night. Somewhere beyond the trees she heard water, not waves crashing theatrically, but a steady, breathing sound, as if the land itself were exhaling. Her hand shook as she fitted the key. The lock turned with a heavy, satisfying click. She drove through. The road bent once, then again, and the trees opened. The house stood on a rise above a narrow cove, cedar-shingled and silvered by weather, with long windows catching the last light and deep porches wrapped around 2 sides as though the whole structure had been built not only to shelter a person but to let them pause. Fieldstone steps led up through late roses and winter herbs gone soft at the edges. A weather vane shaped like a bird turned slowly in the wind. To the left she saw a greenhouse, a small orchard beyond it, and what looked like a separate carriage house tucked behind a screen of spruce. To the right, beyond low grass bending toward the shore, the water shone pewter under the evening sky. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel and did not breathe. It was not merely beautiful. It was familiar in ways beauty had no right to be. The porch rail was the exact height she preferred for leaning. The kitchen window faced east. A swing hung at the far end of the veranda. There were lilac bushes planted near the walk, though they were bare now. And on the front door, worked in iron no casual eye would notice, was a small design of 2 blackbirds facing one another over a branch. The house looked less like a surprise than an answer to a question she had stopped asking years ago. A light came on inside. Then the door opened, and an elderly man in a navy sweater stepped onto the porch. He was spare, weathered, upright in the way of men who spend their lives outdoors and do not bother performing strength because they simply possess it. He came down the steps slowly, as if approaching a sacred moment. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. Eleanor swallowed. "You're Jonah Mercer." "I am." His voice carried the rough music of the coast. "Richard told me if you came, you'd likely be tired, hungry, and too angry to admit to either." Something inside her cracked just enough to let in air. "He was right about one of those," she said. Jonah's mouth softened. "Come inside. There's a fire laid and supper warming. The rest can wait long enough for you to sit down." The house was warm. That was the first thing. Not overheated, not staged into sterile perfection, but deeply, deliberately warm. Wood smoke from the stone hearth. Lamplight pooled on wide plank floors. The air held the scent of beeswax, tea, rosemary, and cedar. Eleanor stepped into the entry hall and felt every nerve in her body strain toward recognition. Her coat brushed against a built-in bench lined with hooks exactly where she would have placed them. Beyond the hall lay a sitting room with shelves rising floor to ceiling, one wall given over entirely to books. A ladder on a brass rail waited beside them. In the kitchen, copper pans hung over an old work table scarred by use. The sink looked out toward the cove. A blue ceramic bowl, the same shade as one Eleanor had once admired in a shop window 30 years ago, rested on the counter catching late pears. She stood in the middle of the room as tears flooded her so suddenly she nearly lost balance. "This is not possible," she whispered. Jonah said nothing for a moment. Then he placed a thick bundle of papers, a leather folio, and a small tape recorder on the table. "It's possible," he said gently. "It just took a very long time." He fed the fire while Eleanor sat. Her fingers hovered over the leather folio. "Richard built this?" she asked. "With his own money, under his mother's maiden name, over 14 years. Quietly. The trust owns the land. Different attorneys from the ones the children know. Different accountants. Different everything." Eleanor looked at him. "Why?" Jonah met her gaze steadily. "Because by the end, he knew exactly what kind of storm he was leaving you in. And because he also knew he should have acted sooner." He touched the folio once, then drew his hand back. "He wrote to you. And there's a recording besides. Said you should decide which to hear first." Eleanor chose the letter. It was long, written by hand on thick cream paper that made the words feel almost ceremonial. Richard's handwriting had grown shakier in his final months, but it was unmistakably his. Eleanor had read grocery lists written in that hand, anniversary notes, hotel addresses, medication schedules. Never anything that made her pulse pound this way before reading even the first line. "My dear Eleanor, if you are sitting in Blackbird House, then I have already failed you once in the ugliest way possible. I let you walk into a room and hear a version of my intentions that must have felt like betrayal. There is no sentence I can write that undoes that wound. I am sorry. Not in the thin way people use that word when apologizing for inconvenience. I am sorry in the marrow of me. You deserved defense in life, not only protection after death." Eleanor stopped there, pressed her hand to her mouth, and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she kept reading. "You have spent 40 years making a home out of other people's needs. You did this for me, for my children, for my mother, and for a life whose comforts often rested on sacrifices no one properly counted. I counted them. Too late, perhaps. Too quietly, certainly. But I counted. 10 years ago, when Grant first came to me about restructuring the firm, I discovered how quickly affection can change when money enters the room. Debts had been taken on without my understanding. Promises had been made in my name. Vanessa, who should know the cost of appearances better than anyone, encouraged decisions built more on entitlement than stewardship. Had I left everything plainly to you through the estate, they would have contested it, delayed it, bled you through courts and time, and called it principle. So I did the only thing left that I believed would hold. The visible estate is exactly that, visible. It contains the Hawthorne house, the controlling shares they wanted, the lake property Vanessa demanded, the collections Patricia has envied for 20 years, and all associated liabilities. Those liabilities are not small. There are maintenance burdens, tax exposures, and personal guarantees tied to Grant's expansions that become his upon acceptance. The Hawthorne residence carries restoration obligations and a conservation easement none of them ever bothered to read. The firm no longer owns the royalty streams from my most profitable designs, nor the consulting retainers they assume remain attached. Those were transferred, legally and irrevocably, into the Mercer House Trust over the past 7 years. Blackbird House, the Cove Land, the Orchard, the Carriage House, the Greenhouse, the investment account that maintains them, and the income from those royalties belong to you outright through the trust. There is enough. More than enough, if used with the common sense you have always possessed and they have always underestimated. If they have already celebrated, let them. Greed often signs documents faster than wisdom reads them. By accepting their distributions, they trigger the no-contest provisions attached to the rest. I wanted to give you something no one could turn into a battlefield. Then, farther down, the handwriting leaned harder into the page, as if emotion had weight. This house began with a conversation you may not remember. Snow at the kitchen window. You said a house should sound like water, wind and trees, a kettle, pages turning. I went to the coast the next week and found this cove. I built it in pieces because I was ashamed of how long I had delayed giving you one thing that was entirely yours. I told myself there would be time to show you when the children settled, when business slowed, when illness passed, when courage arrived. I see now that waiting is often another form of cowardice. There are rooms here shaped by things you once said in passing and likely forgot the next day. The pantry shelves sized for your preserving jars. The reading alcove for your winter blankets. The studio over the carriage house because you once stood in a doorway in Vermont and said, very softly, that every woman should have one room where no one can demand anything from her. Heard you. I did not tell you. Those are not the same. Forgive me if you can. Do not if you cannot. But live here if it gives you peace. Sell it if freedom requires distance. Fill it with laughter that does not ask permission. Invite strangers if strangers are kinder than family. Grow old in the exact shape of yourself, not in the shape others found convenient. There is one more truth you deserve. My greatest shame is not that I saw my children clearly. It is that I did not stop them often enough when they learned to dim your place in the family because your goodness made it easy. I loved you. I love you still. But love without defense leaves bruises. For those bruises, Eleanor, I am sorry beyond speech. Everything that matters is now in your name. Bridget. The paper trembled in her hands. For a long time she could not make sense of her own body. Her throat hurt. Her chest ached. Her face was wet. Grief and relief rose together so violently they became almost indistinguishable. Jonah quietly placed a glass of water near her elbow and stepped away. Eleanor read the letter again, slower this time, the room breathing around her. Outside, wind moved through the grasses above the cove. Somewhere in the house an old beam settled with a soft creak. By the second reading, the words stopped feeling like a miracle and started feeling like something even more destabilizing, the rearrangement of truth. Richard had failed her. That remained true. Richard had also seen far more than she had believed possible. That too was true. She turned then to the tape recorder. The recording began with the scrape of a chair and a long pause. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was thinner than she remembered, but warm, intimate, unbearably alive in its small imperfections. If Jonah has figured out how this machine works, he said, and Eleanor let out a startled laugh through tears, then you're hearing this where I hoped you would. In the kitchen. You always listen best in kitchens. There was the faint sound of him clearing his throat. I used to think provision meant money. It doesn't. Money is only part of it. Provision is shelter. Margin. Safety. It is the absence of people who treat your tenderness like public property. I did not give you enough of that while I was alive. So this is me trying, late and clumsily, to put something around you that can hold. He went on to explain practical matters Jonah and the trust attorney would also cover: accounts, deeds, household operations, annual income, local contacts. But he kept drifting back to memory. The porch swing was my indulgence, he said. You once fell asleep on one in Nova Scotia and said, when you woke, that you'd had the first peaceful nap of your adult life. I never forgot it. Then, quieter, the blackbirds came after. They kept landing on the survey stakes the spring we broke ground. Seemed like a sign. Or maybe I just needed one. Near the end his voice thinned almost to a whisper. If you feel angry, be angry. If you feel nothing for a while, that's all right too. But promise me this much: do not shrink your life to fit the size of what they believed they had taken from you. Please. There is more ahead than behind, even now. Especially now. When the recording ended, the kitchen was silent except for the fire. Eleanor sat with both hands wrapped around the tape recorder as if it were warm. Then, unexpectedly, something rose in her, not sobbing, not speech, but laughter. It broke out of her in one astonished, cracked burst, and because grief had thinned every boundary inside her, the laughter tipped immediately into tears. She bent forward at the table, laughing and crying at once, the sound filling the kitchen with a kind of holy disorder. Jonah, hearing it from the next room, did not come in. He gave her the dignity of release. Later he showed her the rest. There were ledgers proving the trust's holdings. Insurance documents. Letters from a separate attorney in Portland. Revenue statements from Richard's licensing agreements, which were substantial enough to maintain not only the property but Eleanor's independence many times over. The carriage house had 2 finished guest suites above a workshop. The greenhouse was heated year-round. The orchard, though small, supplied a local cooperative each autumn. There was even a fund Richard had established for future uses at Mrs. Whitaker's sole discretion, which Jonah translated with the faintest smile as, "He wanted you to be able to do good with this place if doing good felt like healing." "And the others?" Eleanor asked quietly. Jonah folded his hands. "Your husband knew precisely what he was doing." Grant, it turned out, had pushed Richard into personally guaranteeing debts on a speculative commercial development that had since stalled. Those obligations followed the controlling interests he had been so eager to inherit. Vanessa's coveted lake house required expensive shoreline remediation under environmental review. The Hawthorne property, gracious, admired, and ruinously expensive to maintain, was under a conservation easement Richard had placed on part of the grounds years earlier, making subdivision impossible and limiting alterations without enormous cost. The art collection Patricia prized most highly had been appraised years before at figures far above current resale reality. They wanted visible wealth, Jonah said. Richard left them a museum of appearances and the invoices that come with it. He left you the part that lives. The divine trap was not cruelty. It was revelation made legal. Eleanor rose after that and walked through the house room by room. The library held first editions of authors she loved and had once mentioned only in passing. A reading chair stood beside the window with a lamp angled exactly for evening pages. In the pantry she found wide shelves, low enough to reach comfortably, each labeled in Richard's hand in pencil on the underside as though he had imagined her there, preserving peaches, storing winter squash, lining up jars with the domestic seriousness he had once underestimated. Upstairs, the bedroom looked east over water and pines, with white curtains moving softly in the draught. On the sill sat a vase of dried lavender. Then she found the studio over the carriage house. It faced the cove from 3 sides. Light entered it like blessing. Along one wall stood a long table, blank sketchbooks, charcoal, pencils, and a set of watercolor pans still in their paper wrapping. Near the window, propped on an easel, was a framed scrap of paper she recognized after a long, stunned moment as her own handwriting from years earlier, a grocery list from the back of an envelope on which she had once doodled the floor plan of a house without corridors, muttering to herself while waiting for soup to simmer. Richard had saved it. Eleanor touched the frame and felt the final knot inside her come undone. All those years, she had believed much of herself had gone unrecorded. The invisible labor. The passing remarks. The surrendered dreams. Yet here, board by board and window by window, was evidence that someone had listened so closely he had built her an answer. Not a perfect man. Not an innocent one. But a man who, before the end, had understood the size of his debt. She slept that first night at Blackbird House under a quilt smelling faintly of cedar chests and sunlight. Rain came after midnight, tapping the roof in small, steady fingers. Eleanor woke once, disoriented, then remembered where she was. For a long moment she lay in the dark listening to water and wind and the far hiss of tide against stone, and instead of fear, she felt wonder. The next morning the phone calls began. Jonah had warned her they would. Vanessa left the first message at 8:13 a.m., her voice clipped with alarm. Eleanor, apparently there has been some confusion with father's offshore documents or trust filings or whatever bizarre structure he let that old surveyor manage. Martin says you may have received materials not intended to be acted on without counsel. Please call me immediately. At 8:42 came Grant. I'm sure this looks dramatic, but there are business implications you don't understand. We need to meet before you sign anything. At 9:10 Patricia called, and with breathtaking speed abandoned pretense. I do hope you're not being vindictive at a time like this. Richard would be devastated. Eleanor listened to all 3 without answering. By afternoon Martin Kessler called as well, sounding exhausted. Mrs. Whitaker, I think it best if we speak in person. Certain private instruments were, beyond my office's administration. Mr. Whitaker used separate counsel. Separate counsel. The words were almost musical. Eleanor agreed to no meeting until the following week, and only on her terms at Blackbird House, with the Portland attorney Jonah recommended present. In the meantime she walked the property, learned the path down to the cove, drank tea on the porch, and allowed silence to stop feeling like accusation. Neighbors appeared gradually, as good neighbors often do, not intrusively, but with offerings. Mrs. Alvarez from up the road brought a loaf of still warm bread wrapped in a towel and said, Jonah told us only that the house had come home to its rightful heart. Eleanor did not ask what exactly that meant. She simply invited her in. A young carpenter named Daniel repaired a greenhouse latch and refused payment until Eleanor insisted. An elderly widower with a golden retriever brought over a basket of late apples from his trees and said he was glad to see smoke coming from the Blackbird chimney again. No one asked invasive questions. No one treated her as excess cargo from some other family's wreckage. They met her where she stood. It was almost enough to make a person forget how strange kindness can feel when one has been living on scraps of it. The confrontation came on a Thursday. Vanessa arrived first, stepping from her SUV in a camel coat the color of money and sand, sunglasses pushed into her hair though the day was overcast. Grant came behind her in a city black sedan, jaw tight, phone already in hand. Patricia followed in a hired car, wrapped in indignation and cashmere. With them was Martin Kessler, and beside Eleanor on the porch sat Laura Pike, the Portland Trust attorney, calm as weathered stone. Eleanor had set out tea. That detail unsettled Vanessa more than any display of anger might have done. They sat on the porch because Eleanor preferred the air. Below them, the cove breathed in and out under a pale sky. Gulls wheeled once, then moved on. A kettle warmed inside. The house stood at Eleanor's back like witness. Vanessa began. This has all become unnecessarily adversarial. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. Has it? Grant leaned forward. Father was very sick. You know that. He was vulnerable to suggestion. These trust transfers, if they were concealed from family and primary counsel, raise obvious questions. Laura Pike said pleasantly, not legal ones. The instruments are impeccably executed. Patricia sniffed. Impeccable is not the same as moral. Eleanor turned her gaze to the water for a moment before answering. No, it isn't. The silence that followed was exquisite. Vanessa recovered first. Eleanor, please. Surely you can see how this looks. We are not trying to deprive you. We have always said we want you comfortable. Comfortable. The word floated there, insult dressed as upholstery. Eleanor looked at the woman she had buttoned into winter coats, driven to piano lessons, sat beside after adolescent heartbreaks that felt terminal at the time. Vanessa's face remained beautiful, controlled, baffled by any reality in which her own entitlement was not the organizing principle. You wanted me manageable, Eleanor said quietly. That is not the same thing. Grant's expression hardened. So this is revenge? No, Eleanor said. If it were revenge, I might have left you to discover the full extent of your inheritance without warning. Instead I asked you here so you could hear one thing clearly and in peace. She turned slightly, reached to the table beside her, and laid Richard's letter there, not for them to touch, only to see. Your father knew what you valued, she said. He gave you precisely those things. Large houses. Titles. Visible control. He also knew what those things cost. And he knew what this would cost me if he did not act privately. Her voice did not rise. It deepened. You believed you had won because you could count what was in front of you. Grant looked at Laura Pike. Can the trust be challenged? It can be challenged, Laura said. Anything can. It will not be overturned. Vanessa's composure finally frayed. This is absurd. That property alone is mine, Eleanor said. 3 syllables. Nothing more. Patricia drew herself up. After everything Richard's family gave you. Eleanor turned to her then, and if there was mercy in the look, it was the mercy of plain truth. Your family gave me a surname. I gave it 4 decades of labor. No one spoke. The wind shifted. Somewhere behind the house a screen door clicked. Eleanor poured tea into another cup, set it before herself, and continued with almost unbearable gentleness. I do not intend to humiliate any of you. Life will do enough of that on its own. I also do not intend to surrender what was legally, deliberately, and thoughtfully left to me. The matters attached to Hawthorne Lane, the firm, and the lake property are yours to manage. I wish you wisdom with them. Grant stood so abruptly his chair scraped the porch boards. You're enjoying this? Eleanor met his fury with something far more devastating than anger. No, she said. I am surviving it. Vanessa looked suddenly tired. Younger, somehow, and far less polished. Did he really think so little of us? Eleanor considered the question for several seconds. I think, she said at last, he thought too much of appearances for too many years. About all of us. This was his final correction. That was the true wound. Not the money. Not even the property. It was being seen clearly by the dead after spending years performing for the living. Before they left, Eleanor rose and went inside. She returned carrying a box. In here are copies of photographs from before I married your father, she said to Vanessa and Grant. Your mother is in many of them. So are you when you were small. Whatever else has passed, those are yours if you want them. Vanessa took the box with both hands, stunned into silence. Grant looked away. And just like that, the balance shifted fully. Because generosity offered from strength is impossible to argue with. It leaves the other person alone with the scale of their own smallness. They departed without another scene. Vanessa did not put her sunglasses on again. Grant drove too fast down the lane. Patricia stared straight ahead. Martin Kessler paused only long enough to say, under his breath, he planned further ahead than I knew. Then he followed them to the cars. When the sound of engines disappeared, Eleanor sat back down on the porch and let the quiet settle around her. Her heart was beating fast, but not from fear. From release. From having spoken without bending. From feeling, perhaps for the first time in many years, the clean alignment between what she knew and what she said. Jonah came up the path carrying a basket of kindling and raised one eyebrow in question. They've gone, Eleanor said. He nodded. And? Eleanor looked out at the cove, where low light had turned the water silver blue. And I believe, she said, so has the old version of me. In the weeks that followed, life did not become suddenly perfect. Grief remained. She still woke some mornings reaching for Richard's side of the bed before memory corrected her. There were forms to sign, accounts to transfer, local systems to learn. One section of the greenhouse roof leaked in hard rain. The orchard needed pruning. A gull stole half a scone off the porch table one windy afternoon and stared at her with such brazen triumph that she laughed aloud in spite of herself. But peace, she discovered, was not the absence of practical burdens. It was the absence of people determined to make your burdens heavier. She began to inhabit Blackbird House not as a guest but as a woman finally allowed to take up her full measure. She arranged the kitchen to suit her hands. She stacked books by the chair in the library. She spent mornings in the studio over the carriage house, at first only standing in the light, then sketching the cove, then painting badly and joyfully, then remembering that skill neglected is not skill lost, only sleeping. Mrs. Alvarez brought cuttings for spring. Daniel repaired the porch swing. The widower with the golden retriever, whose name turned out to be Harold, introduced her to the co-op board that bought orchard fruit. A young schoolteacher named Lila asked if Eleanor might someday teach a small watercolor class to the retired women's group. Eleanor almost said no from habit. Then she heard herself say yes. Kindness multiplied in ordinary ways. A basket of pears at the door. A handwritten note from the postmistress welcoming her to the road. Soup brought on a fog-heavy evening by neighbors who had simply made extra. One Sunday after church, 3 women she barely knew stood in her greenhouse discussing tomatoes with such serious delight that Eleanor felt the room inside her where loneliness had lodged begin, at last, to clear. By the 3rd month, the idea came quietly. There were 2 guest suites above the carriage house. The trust income was more than enough. The nearest town had seen rising housing costs. Jonah mentioned one afternoon, while helping Stackwood, that a retired nurse had recently been sleeping on her daughter's sofa after a late-life divorce left her with almost nothing. Mrs. Alvarez knew a widow whose son wanted to sell her house before she was ready. Laura Pike, during a routine call, remarked that older women were often the least protected in inheritance disputes, not because the law lacked tools, but because they had been taught never to wield them. The thought settled in Eleanor like a seed finding the exact soil it needed. She did not want Blackbird House to become a monument. She had lived too long inside other people's monuments already. She wanted it alive. So she opened the carriage house first to one woman, then another, on quiet practical terms. Temporary stays. Dignity preserved. No pity. Meals shared when wanted, privacy respected when needed. She turned the studio's long table into a place for letter writing, planning, paperwork, and tea. Laura Pike agreed to host one free monthly session on wills, trusts, and late-life protection. Mrs. Alvarez organized a supper rotation. Daniel built shelves. Harold offered transport into town. Soon the greenhouse was not merely a greenhouse but a place where women spoke, while repotting rosemary and basil, about the things they had survived without witnesses. Eleanor named the project The Second Table, because she knew now that many people reached late life having never once been seated where they were fully seen. 5 months after the day she had sat in that walnut conference room and been informed she was, essentially, an afterthought, Blackbird House glowed on winter evenings with lamplight, soup steam, and the low murmur of women discovering that safety could still exist this late in life. One room held a retired nurse relearning sleep. Another sheltered a widow who had spent 32 years being told the money was not her concern until, suddenly, none of it was. In the greenhouse, herbs lifted their clean green scent into the air while stories, once buried under embarrassment and endurance, were spoken aloud and met with nods instead of doubt. Eleanor did not call herself their rescuer. She knew better. Rescue suggests weakness, and she had learned that most people were far stronger than the lives around them had allowed. She simply kept the kettle on. She set another place at the table. She helped with letters, with forms, with decisions made in trembling handwriting and quiet bravery. She painted in the mornings now, taught on Thursdays, and walked the cove at dusk with the kind of unhurried step that belongs only to those who no longer need permission to exist. Vanessa wrote once. A brief note. Not warm, but honest in a way she had never managed before. Grant did not write at all. Patricia sent word through attorneys, then stopped. The noise from that old life faded the way storms do after they have exhausted themselves against stronger ground. One snowy evening Eleanor found Richard's letter where she now kept it in the library drawer beside the fire. She read only the final lines, then folded it again with gentle fingers. She had not forgiven everything. Love did not require that. But she understood, at last, that endings are rarely single moments. They are a series of doors. Some close behind you with cruelty. Some open ahead of you with grace so quiet you almost miss it. And standing there in the hush of Blackbird House, with the tide breathing below the cliff and laughter drifting in from the kitchen where someone had just told a story badly and everyone loved her for it, Eleanor felt a peace deeper than vindication. The life she had thought was over had not ended in loss. It had ended in truth. And truth, when it finally arrives, does not always take something from you. Sometimes it gives you back your name, your hands, your future. Sometimes it leads you to a house no one knew existed because, until then, you had not fully existed inside your own life either. If this story found you where you needed it most, comment C. Leave one word in the comments for the moment you realized you were stronger than what tried to break you. Just one word. Let it stand there for someone else who needs to know survival has a language. Share C. And if there is a mother, a sister, a friend, a woman carrying her life too quietly, send this story to her. Not as content, as company. And if you stayed with me all the way to this final door, then you already know what this channel believes. Some stories do not reveal their mercy until the last locked door gives way. Stay for the next one.